The morning sun painted the rolling hills of Mezo village in golden light as a baby boy took his first breath on July 18, 1918. His father, Gadla Henry Mfakanyiswa, looked down at his newborn son with pride. The child would be called Rolilala, which meant pulling the branch of a tree. The small village of Mezo sat peacefully in the eastern cape of South Africa. White officials from the distant government made rules that affected the village. It was here that a teacher gave him an English name, as was the custom in those days. She called him Nelson. The teacher believed that African children needed English names to succeed in the world controlled by white people. This great king had united the Thembu people and made them strong. The storytellers described how the king had been wise and fair, always listening to his counselors before making important decisions. They painted pictures with their words of royal courts where every person, no matter how poor or humble, could speak and be heard. From that day forward, the boy who was Rolilala at home became Nelson at school. She knew this was his chance for a better life. With tears in her eyes, she packed his few belongings and watched as he left their small village for the world of royalty and power. He gave him good clothes to wear and made sure he attended the best school in the area. Most importantly, he treated Nelson as a future leader who deserved respect and education. Poor farmers could criticize the chief's policies right to his face. They never asked for opinions or tried to reach agreement through discussion. Young warriors could suggest different strategies. Old women could share their wisdom about community problems. A true leader did not rule by force or fear. A true leader served his people by listening to them and finding ways to bring them together. Instead, they made him more determined to find ways to help his people. The troublemaker from Mezo was becoming someone who would indeed pull at the branches of an unjust system until the whole tree came crashing down. The stories of warrior ancestors and the lessons of democratic leadership had prepared him for this knowledge. He was ready to begin thinking about how one person might make a difference in changing an unfair world. These lessons would stay with him for the rest of his life. Only after everyone had spoken would the chief offer his own thoughts and try to find solutions that most people could accept. He imagined himself as someone who could help his people and make their lives better. They came from sitting quietly in the corner during tribal meetings. Here he watched Chief Jangantaba lead discussions about important matters affecting their people. The chief never made decisions by himself. Instead, he listened carefully as counselors and common people spoke their minds. His father Gadla became very sick and died. The boy felt lost and confused. His father had been his hero and guide. Teachers and visitors brought news about what was happening in the big cities of South Africa. They spoke of gold mines where black men worked in dangerous conditions for very little money. They described laws that prevented African people from owning good land or getting the best jobs. Chief Jangantaba, the regent of the Thembu people and his father's friend, made an offer that surprised everyone. The white government in faraway places like Cape Town and Pretoria made rules that controlled every aspect of African life. These rules seemed designed to keep black people poor and powerless forever. He invited Nelson to come and live with him at the royal residence called the Great Place in Mkekesweni. This was an incredible honor. The chief wanted to raise Nelson alongside his own son, Justice, giving the young boy the same education and opportunities. Now, what would happen to him and his family? His mother, Nozakini, was strong, but raising children alone in those days was very difficult. But he was just a young boy herding cattle and goats in the hills around Mezo. Such big dreams seemed impossible for a child from a small village. They decided who could be chief and what laws everyone must follow. It was much larger than his home village, with many buildings and hundreds of people living and working there. There were royal advisors, traditional healers, servants, and visitors from other tribes who came to seek the chief's wisdom. Nelson felt small and overwhelmed in this busy, important place. Young Rolilala watched his proud father deal with these white officials who treated him like he was less important than them. Here, cattle grazed on hillsides and children played beside clear streams. The Mandela family belonged to the Thembu people, and they were not ordinary villagers. Rolilala's great-grandfather had been a king, and his father served as a chief and counselor to the Thembu royal family. In their Xhosa tradition, this name carried deeper meaning. It suggested someone who would stir up trouble or challenge the way things were done. Little did anyone know how perfectly this name would fit the tiny baby who would one day shake the foundations of an entire country. Rolihlahla Mandela grew up in a world of green valleys and endless skies. But even in this peaceful place, the shadow of racial inequality touched their lives. When Rolihlahla was 7 years old, he started school at the local Methodist mission. Nelson was a curious child who loved to listen to stories. In the evenings, he would sit with the elders around the fire as they told tales of brave Xhosa warriors who had fought against British soldiers many years before. These stories filled his young mind with images of courage and resistance. The old men spoke of heroes like Chief Makoma and Chief Sandal, who had died defending their land and their people's way of life. But the story that affected Nelson most deeply was about his own ancestor, King Ngubengcuka. These evening stories planted seeds in Nelson's mind. He began to dream of leadership and justice. When Nelson was 9 years old, tragedy struck his family. Then something remarkable happened that would change Nelson's life forever. Nelson's mother made the difficult decision to let her son go. The great place was like nothing Nelson had ever seen. But Chief Jungantaba welcomed Nelson like his own son. The most powerful lessons Nelson learned at the great place did not come from his school books. Nelson saw how the chief allowed everyone to have their say, even those who disagreed with him. This was democracy in action, African style. It was completely different from the way white officials behaved when they visited. Those men gave orders and expected instant obedience. Watching these meetings, teenage Nelson began to understand what real leadership looked like. As Nelson grew into a young man at the great place, he also learned about the wider world beyond their traditional lands. Nelson began to understand that his people faced problems much bigger than anything the tribal meetings could solve. But Nelson was not discouraged by learning about these injustices. The boy called Rolihlahla had grown into a young man named Nelson. Nelson Mandela was 21 years old when his comfortable life at the great place came to a sudden end. Chief Jungantaba had arranged marriages for both Nelson and his son Justice. The chief believed this was best for everyone, following old traditions that parents should choose wives for their sons. But Nelson had different ideas about his future. The thought of marrying someone chosen for him filled Nelson with panic. They stole 2 of the chief's best oxen, sold them to buy train tickets, and headed for Johannesburg. Nelson carried only a few clothes and his high school certificates. He was leaving behind everything he had ever known to chase dreams he could barely imagine. He wanted to make his own decisions about love and marriage. More importantly, he dreamed of getting a university education and becoming a lawyer. An arranged marriage would end those dreams before they could begin? At the great place, he had heard about these problems. Now he was seeing them with his own eyes. The young man who had grown up learning about justice, this was better work that brought him closer to his dream of becoming a lawyer. The lawyers he worked for were white, but they treated him with more respect than he had experienced elsewhere in the city. They even encouraged him to continue his education. And fairness in tribal meetings could not understand how such inequality was allowed to continue. He introduced Nelson to other young African men who were angry about the treatment of their people. These men gathered in small groups to discuss what could be done to fight against racial inequality. Every evening after work, he would sit in his small room reading law books by candlelight. The subjects were difficult, and he often felt discouraged. But he remembered the stories of his warrior ancestors who had never given up in the face of hardship. If anything, it made him more determined to create a better world for his future children. He watched Evelyn work long hours at the hospital, caring for African patients who could not afford to see white doctors in better facilities. The university was supposed to be open to all races, but very few African students were actually allowed to attend. Nelson was often the only black person in his classes. He saw how even educated and skilled black professionals like his wife were treated as second-class citizens. He read books by great thinkers from around the world. He learned about other countries where people had fought against oppression and won their freedom. Most importantly, he began to believe that change was possible in South Africa too. One dark night in 1941, Nelson and Justice made a daring escape from the great place. They believed that Africans should unite across tribal lines to demand their rights as the original inhabitants of South Africa. This was a radical idea that challenged both traditional tribal leadership and white political control. His experiences at the Great Place had taught him how to speak persuasively and listen to different viewpoints. His legal education helped him understand exactly which laws were unjust and why they should be changed. Most importantly, his personal experiences of discrimination gave him the passion needed to inspire others. The making of a revolutionary was complete. When the train pulled into Johannesburg station, Nelson stepped into a world that took his breath away. One of these students, Ahmed Kathrada, became a lifelong friend. He joined the African National Congress, an organization that had been working for African rights since 1912. But Nelson and his young friends thought the older ANC leaders were too polite and patient in their approach to white authorities. He had become a focused political activist with clear goals and strong convictions. The shy village boy who had once feared speaking in public was now addressing packed meetings with confidence and power. These young men believed it was time for more direct action against unfair laws. They were tired of writing respectful letters to the government that were ignored. They wanted to organize mass protests and demonstrations that would force white leaders to pay attention to African demands. From these Indian classmates, Nelson learned about different ways of protesting against unfair laws. They told him about Mahatma Gandhi, who had used peaceful resistance to fight discrimination right there in South Africa many years earlier. The city was enormous, with tall buildings reaching toward the sky like stone mountains. Oliver and Nelson discovered they shared the same dreams of using education to help their people gain equal rights. They spent hours talking about the problems facing Africans and what solutions might be possible. Cars and buses filled the streets with noise and smoke. Thousands of people rushed in all directions, more people than Nelson had seen in his entire life. Black people lived in crowded townships on the edges of the city, while white people enjoyed the best neighborhoods near the center. African workers lived in hostels like prisoners, separated from their families for months at a time. They worked in dangerous gold mines deep underground, digging wealth from the earth that they would never share. Nelson fell in love with her gentle nature and her dedication to helping sick people. They married in 1944. And Nelson finally experienced the happiness of choosing his own wife instead of accepting an arranged marriage. But this golden city had a dark side that Nelson discovered quickly. Nelson's first job was as a security guard at a gold mine. He stood at the gates watching African miners go down into the earth each morning and come up covered in dust each evening. The work was hard and dangerous. Many men got sick from breathing bad air in the tunnels. Some never came home at all. Yet they were paid almost nothing compared to white miners who did easier jobs above ground. This was Nelson's first real lesson about how unfairly black people were treated in their own country. After losing his security job, Nelson found work as an article clerk at a law firm. Nelson began studying for his bachelor's degree through correspondence courses. During this time, Nelson met people who would change his life forever. Walter Sisulu became his closest friend and mentor. Walter was older and wiser about political matters. One of these new friends was Oliver Tambo, a quiet and thoughtful young man who was also studying to become a lawyer. Walter Sisulu also introduced Nelson to his cousin Evelyn Mays, a young nurse who was intelligent and beautiful. But married life did not slow down Nelson's political awakening. In 1943, Nelson enrolled at the University of the Witwatersrand to study law. This was a major step forward in his education. At the university, Nelson met Indian students who were also fighting against racial discrimination. These university years opened Nelson's mind to new ideas about politics and justice. In 1944, Nelson took the most important step of his young adult life. Together with Oliver Tambo and Walter Sisulu, Nelson helped form the ANC Youth League. The Youth League developed a program calling for African nationalism, mass action, and the complete rejection of racial segregation. Nelson quickly became one of the most important voices in the Youth League. By 1948, Nelson Mandela was no longer the confused young man who had fled from an arranged marriage. When the National Party won the 1948 election and promised to make racial segregation, Even stricter through new apartheid laws, Nelson was ready for the fight that lay ahead. The year 1948 brought dark clouds over South Africa. The National Party won the election with promises to make life even harder for black people. They called their plan apartheid, which meant apartness in the Afrikaans language. But this was not just about keeping races separate. It was about making sure white people controlled everything while black people had almost nothing. Nelson Mandela watched in anger as the new government passed law after law designed to crush the hopes of African people. The Population Registration Act divided everyone into racial groups. The Group Areas Act forced black families out of their homes so white people could take the best land. The Bantu Education Act created inferior schools for African children to keep them from getting good jobs. The idea was simple but dangerous. Volunteers would deliberately break unjust laws and go to prison rather than obey them. If enough people did this, the jails would overflow and the government would be forced to change the laws. These laws were more cruel and complete than anything South Africa had seen before. They touched every part of daily life. They entered buildings marked for whites only. They stayed out after curfew without proper passes. They sat on benches reserved for white people. When police arrested them, they went quietly to jail without fighting or causing violence. Black people needed special passes to travel in their own country. They could not vote, own land in most areas, or marry people of other races. He and 50 other protesters entered a township without permits, knowing this would lead to their capture. When the police came, Nelson stood proudly as they put handcuffs on his wrists. This was his first time going to prison for his political beliefs. It would not be his last. He was now a lawyer with his own practice and a leader in the ANC Youth League. He began to believe that polite requests for change would never work. The white government only understood power and force. Black people needed to show they were willing to fight for their rights. More than 8,000 people were arrested for breaking unjust laws. The campaign received attention around the world, with newspapers reporting on the peaceful protests and harsh government responses. Most importantly, thousands of new members joined the ANC. People who had been afraid to get involved in politics now saw that resistance was possible. Most importantly, he had developed the courage and skills needed to fight back against injustice. Guards tried to break the spirits of the activists by treating them like common criminals. But Nelson and his fellow protesters sang freedom songs and encouraged each other. He and Oliver Tambo had opened the first black law firm in South Africa. New laws were passed making it easier to arrest protesters. Police became more violent in breaking up meetings. The government began watching ANC leaders like Nelson very closely, following them and listening to their phone calls. Their office was always crowded with people who needed help dealing with apartheid laws. A man might be arrested and sent far away from his family just for looking for work in the wrong area. Here was a clear vision of the kind of country the liberation movement was fighting to create. It was not about revenge against white people, but about building a society where everyone could live with dignity and opportunity. The document began with powerful words that challenged everything apartheid stood for. The shy young man from a rural village was now a powerful speaker who could move crowds to action. The government had noticed him too. They were watching and waiting for a chance to stop him from causing more trouble for their racist system. We, the people of South Africa, declare for all our country police surrounded the meeting and wrote down the names of everyone who attended. They knew that this document would inspire the liberation movement for years to come. They were right to be worried. And the world to know that South Africa belongs to all who live in it, black and white. Representatives came from all over South Africa to the small township of Kliptown near Johannesburg. They came from different racial groups, different political organizations, and different parts of the country. But they shared the same dream of a free and equal South Africa. It demanded that everyone should have the right to vote, own land, receive equal education, and work in any job they were qualified for. It envisioned a South Africa where the wealth of the country would be shared among all its people. A woman could lose her home because the government decided her neighborhood should be for white people only. Children could be denied education simply because of the color of their skin. For months, He had helped collect ideas from people across the country about what kind of society they wanted to build. These ideas were put together into a document called the Freedom Charter. Poor families came when fathers were arrested for not carrying proper passes. Women sought help when they were forced to move from their homes. Young people needed legal advice when they were denied jobs because of their race. They turned their prison cells into classrooms where they discussed strategies for the struggle ahead. The government was building a system to make sure black people would always be servants to white masters. But Nelson was no longer the confused young man who had arrived in Johannesburg 7 years earlier. He traveled around the country giving speeches to packed meetings. His tall figure and powerful voice inspired thousands of people to join the resistance. He explained to crowds why they should risk arrest and imprisonment for the cause of freedom. In 1952, the ANC decided it was time to take direct action against apartheid laws. They planned what they called the Defiance Campaign. Nelson threw himself into organizing this campaign with tremendous energy. The campaign began on June 26, 1952. All across South Africa, volunteers broke apartheid laws in peaceful ways. Nelson was among the first to be arrested. The experience of being in jail opened Nelson's eyes to how the government treated political prisoners. The cells were crowded and dirty. The food was terrible. When Nelson was released after a few weeks, he returned to his law practice with new determination. Working as a lawyer by day and an activist by night, Nelson saw clearly how the apartheid system hurt ordinary people. These daily injustices made Nelson more angry and more determined than ever. The Defiance Campaign lasted for several months and achieved some important victories. But the campaign also showed Nelson how far the government would go to protect apartheid. In 1955, the ANC organized an even bigger event called the Congress of the People. Nelson was one of the main organizers of this historic gathering. On June 25 and 26, 1955, 3,000 delegates gathered in Kliptown to approve the Freedom Charter. The Freedom Charter called for equal rights for all people regardless of race. When Nelson heard these words read aloud to the cheering crowd, he felt proud to be part of this historic moment. But the government saw the Freedom Charter as a dangerous threat to white rule. By the end of 1955, Nelson Mandela had become one of the most important leaders of the resistance against apartheid. Nelson Mandela stood in the courtroom on December 5, 1956, alongside 155 other anti-apartheid leaders. They were all charged with treason, a crime that could lead to the death penalty. The government claimed these men and women were trying to overthrow the state through violence. Every day, Nelson and his fellow accused had to appear in court to face charges based on documents like the Freedom Charter. The government lawyers argued that calling for equal rights was the same as planning revolution. He watched how the apartheid legal system worked to protect white power. He saw how judges who were supposed to be fair often favored the government's arguments. Most importantly, he learned that the law itself could be used as a weapon against people fighting for justice. But Nelson knew the truth. Their only crime was believing that all people in South Africa deserved equal rights. The government was becoming more violent in its response to peaceful protests. In small towns and big cities, police used clubs and guns to break up meetings. They banned the ANC and arrested thousands of its leaders and members. Nelson found himself in prison again, this time for 5 months without trial. When he was finally released, he discovered that the liberation movement faced a terrible choice. They could give up the struggle or find new ways to fight back. Using false names and disguises, he moved from safe house to safe house around Johannesburg. The police were hunting for him everywhere, but he had learned to live like a shadow. This was the military wing of the ANC, designed to carry out sabotage attacks against government targets. The idea was to damage power stations, railway lines, and government buildings without hurting innocent people. He spent many sleepless nights thinking about whether violence was the right answer. He remembered the peaceful tribal meetings at the Great Place where problems were solved through discussion. He thought about Gandhi's successful use of nonviolent resistance in India. The explosions were carefully timed to happen at night when buildings were empty. Umkhonto wanted to send a message to the government without becoming murderers themselves. He studied military tactics and learned how to make explosives. The quiet lawyer, who had once believed in solving problems through legal arguments, was now learning the skills of a guerrilla fighter. It was a transformation that troubled him deeply, but seemed absolutely necessary. When he did visit them, it had to be in secret and only for short periods. His wife had to raise their family while never knowing if her husband was safe or when she might see him again. They arrested anyone who spoke against apartheid laws. The message was clear: even peaceful resistance would be crushed with force. Nelson found this amusing, but he knew the game of hide and seek with the police could not last forever. Every day underground brought new dangers. He traveled to Algeria, where African freedom fighters were fighting against French colonial rule. He met with military leaders who taught him about guerrilla warfare tactics. He also visited Ethiopia, where he received some basic military training. They would arrive at her house at all hours, searching for Nelson and questioning her about his activities. Too many people knew about his underground activities. Too many informers were passing information to the security police. He had been away from the country, which made him an even bigger target for arrest. While traveling on a road outside Howick in Natal Province, his car was stopped by police. After 17 months underground, the Black Pimpernel had been captured. As the handcuffs clicked around his wrists, Nelson knew that his life as a free man was probably over. Sometimes they arrested her just to put pressure on Nelson to give himself up. She showed tremendous courage in protecting her family while supporting her husband's dangerous work. In country after country, people were fighting against colonial rule and white minority governments. The government had forced the liberation movement to choose between surrender and armed resistance. He had chosen to fight back, and he was prepared to face whatever consequences awaited him. This gave him hope that change was possible, but it also showed him how long and difficult the struggle might be. He concluded that the time for peaceful protest was over. If the government would use violence against peaceful protesters, then the liberation movement had to be prepared to use violence in return. This went against everything he had believed about the power of nonviolent resistance. These were innocent people who had been doing exactly what the ANC had always encouraged, protesting peacefully against unjust laws. Yet they had been gunned down like animals. How could anyone still believe that peaceful resistance would work against such a cruel government? He thought about the millions of black people suffering under apartheid laws. He realized that sometimes violence becomes necessary when all peaceful options have been exhausted. In the township of Sharpeville, police opened fire on a peaceful crowd protesting against the pass laws. 69 people were killed, including women and children. Most were shot in the back as they tried to run away. The Sharpeville massacre shocked the world and showed the true face of apartheid brutality. The treason trial, as newspapers called it, would drag on for more than 4 years. For Nelson, these long court days were both frustrating and educational. But outside the courtroom, much darker events were taking place across South Africa. Then came March 21, 1960, a date that changed everything. Nelson felt sick when he heard the news from Sharpeville. After Sharpeville, the government declared a state of emergency. Nelson made the most difficult decision of his life. In June 1961, Nelson went underground. He left his law practice, said goodbye to his wife Winnie and their children, and became a full-time revolutionary. During this time, Nelson helped create Umkhonto we Sizwe, which meant Spear of the Nation in the Zulu language. Nelson knew that starting an armed struggle was a serious step that would change everything. But every time Nelson considered these peaceful alternatives, he remembered the bodies lying in the dust at Sharpeville. The first sabotage attacks began in December 1961. Small bombs exploded at government offices and power stations across the country. Nelson was the main planner of these operations. The white newspapers called him the Black Pimpernel, comparing him to a character from adventure stories who could slip past enemy forces without being caught. Living in hiding also put enormous strain on Nelson's family life. He could rarely see Winnie and their children. Winnie herself was becoming a target of police harassment. In early 1962, Nelson made a secret trip outside South Africa to gain support for the armed struggle. These trips showed Nelson that the struggle in South Africa was part of a larger movement for freedom across Africa. When Nelson returned to South Africa in July 1962, he knew the police net was closing around him. On August 5, 1962, Nelson's luck finally ran out. But even as he sat in the police car heading toward prison, Nelson felt no regret about the choices he had made. The boy from the Vezo had become a revolutionary leader willing to sacrifice everything for the freedom of his people. Nelson Mandela sat in the dock at the Pretoria court, wearing a traditional Xhosa leopard skin kaross over his suit. This was his way of showing the white judges that he was proud of his African heritage. He was no longer trying to fit into their world. He was there to challenge it completely. But the government was not finished with him. They wanted to destroy the entire leadership of the liberation movement in one giant trial. These crimes carried the death penalty. The newspapers called it the Rivonia trial, and everyone knew it could end with the execution of South Africa's most important black leaders. After his arrest in August 1962, Nelson had been sentenced to 5 years in prison for leaving the country without a passport and organizing illegal strikes. On July 11, 1963, police raided a secret farm in Rivonia, a suburb of Johannesburg. This farm had been the hidden headquarters of Umkhonto we Sizwe. The police found documents, maps, and evidence of sabotage plans. Most importantly, they arrested several top ANC leaders who were meeting there. Nelson listened as prosecutor Dr. Percy Utar painted him as a dangerous terrorist who wanted to destroy white civilization in South Africa. The prosecutor claimed that Nelson and his friends were communists working for foreign enemies to bring chaos and bloodshed to the country. But he also saw this trial as the greatest opportunity he would ever have to explain his beliefs to the world. When the time came for the defense to present its case, Nelson made a decision that shocked everyone. He would not simply answer the charges. He would give a speech that would explain exactly why he had chosen the path of armed resistance. He talked about growing up in a traditional African society where chiefs ruled through consultation and consensus. He described coming to Johannesburg and seeing how apartheid crushed the dreams and hopes of his people. Outside the courthouse, police with guns surrounded the building. They would show the world why decent people had been forced to choose violence when all peaceful options were blocked. Inside, the courtroom was packed with supporters, journalists, and government officials. He knew this might be the last time he would ever speak in public. He made it clear that he was not fighting against white people as such, but against a system that denied basic human rights to the majority of South Africans. If the judge sentenced him to death, these could be his final words to the world. Nelson looked directly at the judge as he spoke his conclusion. During my lifetime, I have dedicated myself to this struggle of the African people. I have fought against white domination, and I have fought against black domination. I have cherished the ideal of a democratic and free society in which all persons live together in harmony and with equal opportunities. It is an ideal which I hope to live for and to achieve. But if needs be, it is an ideal for which I am prepared to die. The whole world was watching to see what would happen to Nelson Mandela and his fellow fighters. All the defendants except one were found guilty on all charges. The courtroom held its breath as the judge prepared to announce the sentences. Would these brave men be sent to their deaths for fighting against injustice? Winnie was there, tears streaming down her face, but her head held high with pride. Their children would grow up without their father, but they would know he had stood up for what was right. When this form of protest was legislated against, and when the government resorted to a show of force to crush opposition to its policies, only then did we decide to answer violence with violence. He had transformed himself from a defendant into a moral teacher. Governments and human rights organizations sent messages asking for mercy. Protesters gathered outside South African embassies in many countries. Everyone understood that this trial was about more than just the fate of 10 men. It was about whether justice and humanity could survive in South Africa. He had turned a criminal trial into a lesson about justice and human dignity. Now Nelson faced much more serious charges. Along with Walter Sisulu, Ahmed Kathrada, and 7 other men, he was accused of sabotage and conspiracy to overthrow the government. Nelson felt a mixture of relief and sadness. He would live, but he would probably spend the rest of his life in prison. At age 46, he was saying goodbye to freedom forever. He listed the laws that treated black people like children who could not make their own decisions. He described how the government had responded to peaceful demonstrations with bullets and batons. They had witnesses who could testify about his role in creating Umkhonto we Sizwe. They had evidence of his trips to other African countries to get military training and support. The trial began on October 9, 1963, in the Palace of Justice in Pretoria. Here was a man facing possible execution, yet he spoke without hatred or bitterness. He explained his actions with the calm logic of a lawyer making his case. The government's case seemed very strong. They had documents in Nelson's handwriting that proved he had helped plan sabotage attacks. But Nelson and his lawyers had a different strategy. Instead of denying the charges, they would use the trial to put the apartheid system itself on trial. For months, the trial continued with the government presenting its evidence. Nelson knew that his life hung in the balance. On April 20, 1964, Nelson rose in the dock to address the court. He had spent weeks writing and memorizing his speech. For 4 hours, Nelson spoke with passion and dignity about his life and beliefs. Nelson explained why the ANC had tried peaceful protest for 50 years before turning to violence. "We first broke the law in a way which avoided any recourse to violence," Nelson told the packed courtroom. The courtroom was completely silent as Nelson spoke. Even the white officials seemed moved by his words. Nelson told the court about his admiration for democracy and how he had been influenced by the British parliamentary system and the American Constitution. Then came the words that would echo around the world for generations. The silence in the courtroom was complete. Nelson sat down, knowing he had said everything he needed to say. For weeks after Nelson's speech, the world waited for the judge's decision. On June 11, 1964, Judge Cordis DeWitt announced his decision. "The sentence in the case of all the accused will be one of life imprisonment," the judge declared. As the guards led Nelson away in chains, he managed to smile and raise his fist to the supporters in the courtroom. The boy from Mvezo had become a symbol of resistance that no prison could contain. The boat cut through the cold waters of Table Bay, carrying Nelson Mandela toward a place that would be his home for the next 18 years. Robben Island lay 7 miles off the coast of Cape Town, a rocky prison surrounded by sharks and treacherous currents. For centuries, this island had been used to lock away people the government wanted to forget. At 46 years old, he might never see the mainland again? The warders who met him made it clear that here he was not Nelson Mandela, the lawyer or political leader. He was simply prisoner number 46,664. Every morning, he and hundreds of other political prisoners were marched to this giant hole in the ground where they broke rocks with hammers and picks. The white limestone dust got into their eyes, their lungs, and their clothes. Under the blazing South African sun, the work was backbreaking and seemed pointless. Now it would hold South Africa's most famous political prisoner. As Nelson stepped onto the concrete dock in June 1964, wearing the rough prison uniform of khaki shirt and shorts, he felt the full weight of his life sentence. The political prisoners turned Robben Island into what they called the University of the Struggle. During lunch breaks and quiet moments, they taught each other languages, history, politics, and philosophy. Men who had never learned to read were taught by university graduates. Professors learned practical skills from workers and farmers. The limestone quarry became Nelson's workplace for the next 13 years. He slept on a straw mat on the concrete floor with only thin blankets for warmth. He studied Afrikaans, the language of his oppressors, believing that understanding their culture would help him negotiate with them someday. Other prisoners thought he was crazy to learn the enemy's language, but Nelson believed that knowledge was power. In winter, the cold Atlantic winds made the cell feel like a freezer. In summer, the heat was stifling. Despite being separated during work and locked in individual cells at night, they found ways to communicate. They passed notes hidden in food containers, scratched messages on walls, and developed hand signals for silent conversations. They created their own rules about how prisoners should behave toward each other and toward the guards. They organized protests when conditions became too harsh, sometimes refusing to eat until their demands were heard. But Nelson refused to let the prison authorities break his spirit. The prisoners won the right to receive more letters from family members. They gained permission to study through correspondence courses. They convinced authorities to allow them to play sports and organize cultural activities. Instead of becoming bitter and angry, he seemed to grow calmer and wiser with each passing year. He treated even the cruelest guards with politeness and respect. Nelson was allowed to see Winnie and his children only twice a year for 30 minutes each time. They had to speak through thick glass and could not touch each other. He watched his daughters grow up in snapshots and letters, missing every birthday, graduation, and important moment in their lives. When new warders arrived full of hatred for the political prisoners, Nelson would slowly win them over with his dignity and intelligence. The angry young man who had once believed that armed resistance was the only solution slowly evolved into a more thoughtful leader. He started to believe that negotiation might eventually be necessary to prevent a racial war that would destroy South Africa. They wanted to know if he would consider conditional release in exchange for renouncing violence. Nelson's answer was always the same. He would discuss peace when the government was ready to grant equal rights to all South Africans. They arrested her repeatedly, banned her from speaking in public, and eventually sent her into internal exile in a small Free State town. Through it all, she remained loyal to Nelson and the struggle, but the strain was enormous on their marriage. Songs were sung about him, streets were named after him, and governments demanded his release. But more importantly, he had used his time in prison to prepare himself for the greatest challenge of his life, leading South Africa from apartheid to democracy without destroying the country in the process. The men debated whether the ANC should negotiate with the apartheid government or continue armed struggle until total victory. They argued about which countries might help their cause and how to keep hope alive among black South Africans on the mainland. He completed his law degree through correspondence with the University of London. He read books about history, politics, and literature. He was especially interested in the Afrikaner struggle against British rule, trying to understand the people who now oppressed him. On his first day in the quarry, a young warder ordered him to jog to his work area. Nelson walked slowly instead, maintaining his dignity despite the guards' angry shouts. They offered better food or easier work to prisoners who would give information about their comrades. They spread rumors to create suspicion and mistrust. They separated friends and tried to turn prisoners against each other. Some were members of the Pan-Africanist Congress who believed only black people should lead the liberation struggle. Others were communists who wanted to completely change South Africa's economic system. Nelson's skills as a peacemaker, learned in the tribal councils of his youth, helped keep these different groups working together. When the warder threatened punishment, Nelson calmly explained that he was nearly 50 years old and would not be running anywhere. The prison routine was designed to crush hope and destroy identity. Prisoners woke at dawn, ate thin porridge for breakfast, worked hard labor all day, and returned to their cells at sunset. African prisoners received worse food than Indian or colored prisoners, part of the racial hierarchy that apartheid imposed even in jail. Nelson's cell was tiny, just 8 feet by 7 feet, with a small window that showed only a slice of sky. But something remarkable began to happen in this place of punishment. Nelson became both student and teacher in this prison university. Walter Sisulu, Ahmed Kathrada, and other ANC leaders were also on Robben Island. These secret discussions covered everything from liberation strategy to personal problems. Nelson often found himself mediating disputes between prisoners from different political organizations. The warders tried many tricks to break the prisoners' unity, but Nelson and his fellow leaders maintained discipline and solidarity. Slowly, through years of patient pressure, conditions on Robben Island began to improve. Nelson threw himself into his studies with the same determination he had once used to plan sabotage operations. The prison authorities were puzzled by Nelson's behavior. Family visits were the most painful part of prison life. Winnie herself was facing constant harassment from the security police. As the years passed, Nelson began to change his thinking about the liberation struggle. In the early 1980s, government officials began making secret contact with Nelson. By 1988, after 24 years in prison, Nelson Mandela had become the most famous prisoner in the world. The man who entered Robben Island as an angry revolutionary would emerge as a wise statesman ready to heal a wounded nation. On February 11, 1990, Nelson Mandela woke up in Victor Verster prison near Cape Town knowing this would be the most important day of his life since his trial 26 years earlier. After 27 years behind bars, he was finally going to walk free. But this freedom came with enormous responsibility. The whole world would be watching to see what he would do next. For decades, the apartheid government had insisted that Nelson Mandela was a dangerous terrorist who could never be freed. Now they were not only releasing him, but also unbanning the ANC and promising to negotiate a new political system. He put on his best suit and tie, knowing that millions of people would see his first moments of freedom on television. At 71 years old, with white hair and a lined face, he looked very different from the young revolutionary who had entered prison in 1964. Nelson Mandela stepped into the sunlight, hand in hand with Winnie, and raised his right fist in the liberation salute. The crowd erupted in cheers and songs. Camera flashes lit up the scene like lightning. This was the moment the world had been waiting for. Many had been there since early morning, singing freedom songs and waving ANC flags. For most of them, this was the first time they had ever seen their hero in person. She had waited 27 years for this moment, raising their children alone while facing constant persecution from the security police. To his supporters, he promised that the struggle for freedom would continue until all South Africans had equal rights. To white South Africans, he offered reassurance that the ANC sought negotiation, not revenge. Black townships were burning as rival political groups fought each other. White extremists were threatening to fight any changes to the apartheid system. The country could easily explode into violence that would destroy any hope of peaceful transition. To the world, he expressed gratitude for the pressure that had helped secure his release. Now she would finally walk beside her husband as a free man. He met with business leaders, religious figures, and ordinary white families. He spoke their language, literally and figuratively, using his prison years of studying Afrikaans culture to build bridges. These two men, who had been enemies for decades, now had to work together to prevent their country from tearing itself apart. They met regularly in secret locations, sometimes in government buildings, sometimes in private homes. These were his people who had waited so patiently for this day. Nelson represented the African majority that had every reason to seek revenge. Yet both men understood that their country's survival depended on finding compromise. Nelson was furious that de Klerk had betrayed their trust while talking about peace. He considered ending the negotiations completely. Instead of walking away, he used the scandal to pressure the government into making more concessions. He demanded that all political prisoners be released and that security forces stop supporting violence between African groups. Angry crowds gathered in townships across the country, ready to abandon negotiations in favor of revolution. This seemed impossible when he was released from prison. The apartheid government insisted that group rights and racial classifications must continue in some form. Most importantly, the example of other African countries that had achieved democracy showed that racial reconciliation was possible. But he also knew that millions of white South Africans were watching on television, afraid of what his release might mean for their future. Nelson stood in line with millions of other South Africans, black and white, to cast his vote. At age 75, he was voting for the first time in his life. The boy from the Vezo, who had herded cattle in rural Transkei, would now lead a rainbow nation toward an uncertain but hopeful future. When he emerged from the voting booth, tears streamed down his face. Many young ANC members wanted immediate revolution. They had suffered under apartheid for decades and saw no reason to negotiate with their oppressors. President F.W. de Klerk had announced Nelson's release 9 days earlier, sending shockwaves around the globe. He spoke directly to the anger and pain of his people, acknowledging their desire for revenge, while asking them to honor Chris Haney's memory by continuing the peaceful struggle. His words helped prevent the country from exploding into racial war. Nelson spent his last morning in prison carefully preparing for his release. Winnie arrived at the prison early in the morning. accompanied by a crowd of journalists, photographers, and ANC supporters. In meeting after meeting, he explained that the ANC was not strong enough to defeat the apartheid government by force. The white minority still controlled the army, police, and economy. A violent revolution would destroy the country and hurt black people most of all. At exactly 4:16 in the afternoon, the gates of Victor Verster prison swung open. But Nelson's first taste of freedom was overwhelming. Thousands of people pressed forward trying to touch him or take his picture. Cars blocked the roads leading from the prison. The carefully planned route to Cape Town became a slow procession through crowds of celebrating supporters. When Nelson finally reached the Grand Parade in Cape Town, more than 50,000 people were waiting to hear him speak. Standing on the balcony of City Hall, Nelson looked out at the sea of faces below. Nelson's speech that day was carefully crafted to send messages to different audiences. But even as crowds celebrated in the streets, Nelson knew that his greatest challenges lay ahead. South Africa was on the edge of a civil war. In the weeks following his release, Nelson began the delicate work of building trust with former enemies while keeping control of his own supporters. Nelson had to convince these angry young people that negotiation was not surrender but strategy. At the same time, Nelson had to prove to white South Africans that he was not the dangerous radical they had been told to fear. The most important relationship Nelson had to build was with President F.W. de Klerk. These meetings were not easy. De Klerk represented the white minority that had oppressed black people for centuries. The negotiations faced crisis after crisis. In July 1991, newspapers revealed that the government had been secretly funding the Inkatha Freedom Party to fight against the ANC, but Nelson had learned patience during his long years in prison. The worst crisis came in April 1993 when Chris Hani, the popular young leader who many expected to succeed Nelson, was assassinated by white extremists. Nelson appeared on television that night to appeal for calm. Through all these challenges, Nelson never lost sight of his ultimate goal, a democratic election where all South Africans could vote regardless of race. But Nelson's moral authority and negotiating skills gradually wore down white resistance. International pressure continued to build. Economic sanctions hurt the white-controlled economy. On April 27, 1994, South Africa held its first democratic election. The ANC won the election with 62% of the vote, making Nelson Mandela the first black president of South Africa. On May 10, 1994, Nelson Mandela stood on the steps of the Union Buildings in Pretoria, preparing to become president of the country that had imprisoned him for 27 years. Thousands of people filled the gardens below, including world leaders, dignitaries, and ordinary South Africans of every race. Above them, jets of the South African Air Force roared overhead in salute to the new president. From the hills of the Transkei to the limestone quarry of Robben Island to the highest office in the land, his life had been a testament to the power of perseverance and forgiveness. Sitting beside Nelson was F.W. de Klerk, now his deputy president. The man who had ordered his release from prison was now working under the former prisoner. They wanted better houses, schools, hospitals, and jobs. They had waited patiently for freedom, and now they wanted to see immediate improvements in their daily lives. This strange partnership symbolized the delicate balance Nelson would have to maintain as president. As Nelson raised his right hand to take the oath of office, he thought about the long journey that had brought him to this moment. The decision angered many of his supporters, but Nelson believed that small sacrifices for reconciliation were worth making. The tournament became a powerful symbol of the new Rainbow Nation. Black and white South Africans cheered together for the same team, something that would have been impossible just a few years earlier. Nelson decided to attend the match wearing a Springbok jersey with the number 6, the same number worn by the team captain Francois Pienaar. When he walked onto the field, the mostly white crowd gave him a thunderous standing ovation. White South Africans controlled most of the economy and still dominated the civil service, police, and military. Nelson had to deal with practical problems that threatened to tear the country apart. Violence continued in many townships as different political groups fought for control. The economy was struggling and unemployment was rising. Crime was increasing as desperate people turned to illegal activities to survive. Television cameras broadcast these emotional sessions to the entire nation. South Africans watched as mothers testified about their children who had been killed by security forces. They heard police officers admit to torturing prisoners. They saw former enemies face each other and sometimes even forgive each other. Many were terrified that black majority rule would mean revenge, violence, and the destruction of everything they had built. The image of the black president embracing the white Afrikaner captain became one of the most powerful symbols of the new South Africa. Many ANC members had expected to take over all the powerful positions in government immediately. They were frustrated when Nelson insisted on keeping white civil servants and military officers in their jobs during the transition period. This admission shocked some of his supporters, but it showed his commitment to truth and accountability. He understood that real reconciliation required honesty about the past from all sides. In that moment, Nelson showed the world what reconciliation looked like. His marriage to Winnie had been deteriorating for years, damaged by the long separation during his imprisonment and their different approaches to politics. In 1996, they divorced, ending one of the most famous political partnerships in African history. Some perpetrators refused to cooperate or told only partial truths. Graca brought stability and joy to Nelson's life during his presidency, supporting his work while pursuing her own career as an advocate for women and children's rights. Many African leaders had clung to power for decades, destroying their country's democratic institutions. But Nelson announced early in his presidency that he would not seek re-election in 1999 by voluntarily giving up power. He set a powerful example for future African leaders and strengthened South Africa's democratic foundations. But the process helped South Africa avoid the cycle of revenge that had destroyed other countries emerging from conflict. But the ceremony also highlighted the enormous challenges facing the new South Africa. The former prisoner had served his country with dignity and wisdom, proving that even the deepest wounds could be healed through forgiveness and understanding. Nelson's first task was to unite a country that had been divided by hatred for centuries. Firing all the white officials would have created chaos and possibly triggered a white exodus that would have damaged the economy. Instead, he insisted on gradual transformation that would bring black people into positions of power without destroying institutional knowledge. Instead of putting apartheid criminals on trial like war criminals, Nelson chose a uniquely South African solution. People who had committed political crimes could receive amnesty if they told the truth about what they had done. They accused him of being too soft on white people and too slow to deliver real change for the black majority. But Nelson believed that his job was to be president of all South Africans, not just those who had voted for him. Black South Africans, on the other hand, expected rapid changes after decades of suffering under apartheid. The Springbok rugby team had been a symbol of white South Africa for decades. Many ANC supporters wanted to change the team's name, colors, and emblem immediately. They saw these symbols as reminders of apartheid oppression. Nelson understood that he could not satisfy everyone completely, but he believed that his greatest strength as president would be his moral authority rather than his political power. He would lead by example, showing both black and white South Africans that reconciliation was possible. One of Nelson's most important early decisions involved the country's sports teams. But Nelson made a surprising choice. He decided to keep the Springbok emblem, understanding that this gesture would reassure white South Africans who feared losing everything they valued. This decision paid off dramatically during the 1995 Rugby World Cup, which South Africa was hosting. The tournament's climax came when South Africa reached the final against New Zealand. After South Africa won the match, Nelson presented the trophy to Pienaar in front of 65,000 spectators and millions watching on television. But building a rainbow nation required more than symbolic gestures. Nelson's most important tool for healing the nation's wounds was the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Led by Archbishop Desmond Tutu, the Truth Commission held hearings across the country where victims of apartheid could tell their stories and perpetrators could confess their crimes. Nelson himself appeared before the Truth Commission to acknowledge that the ANC had also committed human rights violations during the struggle. The Truth Commission was not perfect, and it did not satisfy everyone. Some victims felt that amnesty was too easy for those who had committed terrible crimes. As president, Nelson also had to manage the expectations of his own supporters. Nelson explained that South Africa needed the skills and experience of these people to keep the country running. This approach sometimes made Nelson unpopular with radical members of his own party. Nelson's presidency was also marked by personal challenges, but Nelson found happiness again when he married Graca Machel, the widow of former Mozambican President Samora Machel. Perhaps Nelson's greatest achievement as president was his decision to step down after serving only one term. This decision shocked many people who expected him to remain president for life. But Nelson understood that true leadership sometimes means knowing when to let go. On June 16, 1999, Nelson Mandela handed over the presidency to Thabo Mbeki and returned to private life. Nelson Mandela woke up on his 81st birthday in 1999 as a free man for the first time in decades. No longer bound by the heavy responsibilities of the presidency, he could finally choose how to spend his remaining years. But retirement did not mean rest for the man the world had come to call Madiba, his clan name that had become a term of endearment across South Africa. The years after his presidency revealed a different side of Nelson Mandela. Away from the formal ceremonies and political pressures, he became more relaxed and playful. He delighted in spending time with his grandchildren, telling them stories about his childhood in the Transkei. He would laugh loudly at jokes, dance at family gatherings, and show the warm, human side that had been hidden behind his presidential dignity. Millions of people were dying from a disease that could be treated if they had access to proper medicine. But Nelson's honesty opened the door for millions of families to speak openly about their own losses. He established the 46,664 Foundation, named after his prison number, to raise money and awareness for AIDS prevention and treatment. When civil war tore apart Burundi, he spent months shuttling between different groups trying to negotiate peace. He met with rebels in the mountains and government officials in the capital, using his moral authority to convince them that violence would solve nothing. He believed that education was the most powerful weapon for changing the world, and he wanted to make sure that poor children had the same opportunities he had been given as a young man. But many African leaders were too embarrassed or ignorant to address the crisis openly. This position angered some Western governments who had supported his fight against apartheid. But Nelson believed that moral leadership sometimes required taking unpopular stands. The years of hard labor in the limestone quarry had damaged his lungs. The stress of prison life and political leadership had taken its toll on his body. He moved more slowly and spoke more quietly, but his mind remained sharp and his spirit strong. He remembered how education had opened doors for him, and he wanted to give other young people the same chance to escape poverty through learning. World leaders continued to visit him at his home in Johannesburg, seeking his advice and blessing. When Barack Obama was elected as the first black president of the United States, he called Nelson to thank him for showing that change was possible. His marriage to Graca Machel brought him great happiness and companionship. She cared for him with devotion while continuing her own work as an advocate for children's rights. He took special pride in seeing how they had grown up to become successful, confident people despite the challenges of having such a famous grandfather. In 2005, he announced that his oldest son Makatho had died from the disease. Standing before television cameras with tears in his eyes, Nelson said that his family would not hide the cause of death. But the man himself preferred quiet celebrations with family and close friends. He had never sought fame for its own sake, and he remained humble despite being one of the most admired people on earth. When South Africa hosted the FIFA World Cup in 2010, he made his last major public appearance at the final match. The stadium erupted in applause when his face appeared on the giant screens, and the crowd sang happy birthday even though it was not his birthday. The news spread around the world within minutes, and people everywhere mourned the loss of a man who had shown them the power of forgiveness and reconciliation. The boy who had herded cattle on those hills had traveled the world and changed history, but he had chosen to return home for his final rest. It was their way of showing love for a man who had given them so much. His example continues to inspire people fighting against injustice everywhere. When protesters gather for civil rights, they carry his picture. When leaders face difficult choices between revenge and reconciliation, they remember his example. He wanted to remove the shame and stigma that prevented people from getting help. At a press conference, he announced that he was becoming what he called a senior citizen who deserved to rest. But the simple truth he lived, that we can choose to be better than our worst impulses, and that tomorrow can indeed be better than today if we have the courage to make it so. The man who had never stopped fighting for others finally gave himself permission to step back from the world stage. His body lay in state in Pretoria, where thousands of people waited in long lines to pay their respects. Presidents, prime ministers, and ordinary citizens stood together to honor a man who had touched their lives. Barack Obama, Bill Clinton, and dozens of other presidents spoke about what Nelson had meant to them. But the most moving tributes came from ordinary South Africans, who sang the freedom songs they had learned during the struggle against apartheid. But Nelson could not completely step away from public life. The world still looked to him for moral leadership, and he felt a responsibility to use his influence for good causes. He became what people called a global elder statesman, speaking out on issues that mattered to him regardless of what governments might think. One of Nelson's greatest concerns in his later years was the AIDS epidemic that was devastating Africa. Nelson broke the silence around AIDS in the most personal way possible. This announcement shocked South Africa, where AIDS was still considered a taboo subject. Nelson also continued his work as a peacemaker in conflicts around the world. In Iraq, Nelson spoke out against the American invasion, arguing that war would bring more suffering than peace. The foundation that Nelson established in his name became a powerful force for education and rural development in South Africa. Nelson particularly focused on building schools in rural areas like the Transkei, where he had grown up. As Nelson entered his 80s, his health began to decline. In 2004, Nelson made the difficult decision to retire from public life completely. But even in retirement, Nelson remained a global icon. Nelson's relationship with his family became more important than ever during these final years. His children and grandchildren visited regularly, and Nelson loved hearing about their lives and achievements. The world celebrated Nelson's 90th birthday in 2008 with concerts, festivals, and tributes from every continent. In his final years, Nelson's appearances became rarer and more precious. On December 5, 2013, Nelson Mandela died peacefully at his home in Johannesburg at the age of 95. For 10 days, South Africa and the world said goodbye to Madiba. The memorial service in Johannesburg became one of the largest gatherings of world leaders in history. Nelson was buried in his childhood village of Kunu in the Eastern Cape, not far from where he had been born 95 years earlier. But death could not end Nelson Mandela's influence on the world. Schools around the world teach children about the man who showed that love is stronger than hate, that forgiveness is more powerful than revenge, and that one person's conscience can indeed change the course of history. The troublemaker from Mizo had become humanity's teacher, proving that no matter how dark the night, the dawn of freedom will always come to those who never stop believing in justice. Nelson Mandela's greatest legacy is not the offices he held or the awards he received.